This short video will provide an introduction to the experiential learning cycle proposed by David Kolb. It will then introduce the idea of discipleship and the relationship between discipling someone to Jesus and in Jesus. And as a basis for that, then we'll begin to look at the storyline 2.0 in light of both our understanding of discipleship and the experiential learning cycle. The experiential learning cycle was first proposed by David Kolb as he sought to describe how learning actually took place. He believed that all learning begins with a concrete experience of some sort. An individual then reflects on that experience, and that experience either creates a sense of equilibrium with what is known, believed, and valued, or it creates a sense of disequilibrium. It throws a person off balance. They don't know quite how to make sense of it. In the reflective observation stage, an individual seeks to interpret the experience and to wrestle with alternative interpretations. At the abstract conceptualization stage, the individual wrestles with the interpretation of the experience or alternative interpretations and tries to integrate them into their sense of self, their understanding of the world around them, and creates alternative ways of understanding things. They then experiment with that new set of beliefs or values or that new action, and that then generates more concrete experience for reflection. It is very cyclical. So let me give you an example. Concrete experience: I'm in a meeting and I lose my temper. And as I leave the meeting, having lost my temper, I reflect on what contributed to me losing my temper. I evaluate whether my response was appropriate or not. And then I decide, after reflecting on those experiences and alternative interpretations, that it's just too much work to lose your temper in a meeting. You have too much of a big mess to clean up. And so I decide that if I'm ever in a meeting again and I feel like I'm going to lose my temper, I will just disengage. I won't say anything, and if necessary, I will leave. A few weeks later, I'm in a meeting, and things are not going well. I feel like I'm beginning to lose my temper, and I excuse myself from the meeting and go back to my office. On reflection, my supervisor calls me and says, "Hey, why did you leave the meeting?" And I said, "Well, I was beginning to lose my temper. I know that when I lose my temper, it creates other problems, so I decided to exit the meeting at that time." My supervisor says, "Oh, I get it now. I understand. Let's reflect on that a little bit to see how you might leave the meeting in a more effective manner." Kolb sought to describe how learning actually takes place in people's lives. And he believed that this is true of children, as well as high school kids, college students, and even adults, that we move through this experiential learning cycle in order to make sense of things. Actually, this experiential learning cycle, I believe, is appropriate to describe what takes place in a formal educational setting in a classroom, as well as in a small group, as well as informally. So let's keep this in mind. We'll be coming back to this again and again and again. Okay? Now, the second thing we want to cover in this video is the idea of discipleship. Parrott and Packer describe discipleship as taking someone from where they are to where they need to go. Okay? And generally in our tradition and in many other traditions, we talk about evangelism and discipleship. You evangelize someone and you disciple them. Unfortunately, I think that language is very inaccurate in our setting because it assumes a certain understanding of the gospel. It also assumes that the gospel is something you do in evangelism. It's not essential to the Christian life. In this model here, we see that we disciple people to Jesus. That is, for the non-Christian, we are in the process of taking them from where they are to where they need to be, and that is the conversion experience. And with that, we disciple them to Jesus. We engage their questions, we engage their issues, we wrestle with them, and we bring the gospel to bear on their lives. Now, there's a point at which conversion takes place where one recognizes their dependence on Christ and Christ alone. After that point, we begin to disciple people in Jesus, that is, into a relationship with Jesus. Disciple them to appreciate what it means to be a son or daughter of God, as Romans 8 describes us. In this discipleship in Jesus, both the gospel is also essential, because the gospel reminds us that we cannot save ourselves, that we're ultimately dependent on God. As a matter of fact, I think if we take this seriously, if someone who is growing and maturing in Christ will become more and more and more aware of the depth of the sin in their lives, and their need then more and more deeply for the gospel. If that's not taking place, then discipleship in Jesus easily becomes a set of morals and behaviors that we expect someone to live into. And so when we talk about teaching and we talk about discipleship, it's important to remember, are we talking about discipling someone to Jesus, or are we talking about discipling someone in Jesus? Okay? Now, one approach to discipleship, one curriculum, one plan, has been offered by Donald Miller in what is entitled Storyline 2.0, Finding Your Subplot in God's Story. This is a curriculum that I use, slightly modified, of course, but I use in order to begin the discipleship journey both with non-Christians and Christians. It can be used both ways. One of the reasons I like this story is it begins with the concrete experience of a person and then calls them to reflect on those experiences as well as to consider alternative interpretations. Okay? Storyline 2.0 is the beginning of the discipleship process. As a matter of fact, after I take someone through this storyline material, we usually make a judgment call about whether we're going to study the catechism, whether we're going to study a book of the Bible, whether we're going to go after a topic or an issue that's of interest to them. So as you move through the discipleship process with your disciplee later in this course, you'll be using the storyline material. Okay? And I'm going to provide you some brief surveys and overviews of that material as you prepare for that journey. So in your first session, you'll be sharing with them that we're going to be looking at the story of their lives and how that story intersects with God's story, the true story of the world, as Michael Goheen calls it. And in order to get a handle on both the concrete experience of the individual and the reflective observation, you're going to ask them to identify 20 significant events in their lives. 20 significant events. And you're going to ask them to interpret those events in two ways. One, was it a positive event or a negative event? Was it positive or negative? I might say a turning event in my life was my first job. My first job in middle school was mowing yards, and I made lots of money. It was a positive turn. I might say a negative turn was breaking up with my first girlfriend in high school. It was emotionally traumatic. It was negative. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is ask them to characterize those events as either a positive or negative. The second thing you're going to do is ask them to describe how positive and negative it was. Okay, my first job was a positive 5. The breakup with my girlfriend might have been a negative 5. But how positive, how was it? How traumatic was it? And so the first thing you need to do is to help them identify those concrete experiences, have them identify them chronologically, I hope, and then how positive or negative were they? Okay, and as they identify these experiences, they can be just short descriptions, 2 or 3 or 4 words, nothing more. Okay, just ask them to do that. After you ask them to identify those experiences and identify them as positive or negative and then rate them, you're going to plot them on a storyline. And you're going to plot them in a chronological order. And as they plot the storyline, as they plot the events in their lives, all you're going to do is listen to them and ask clarifying questions. Okay? Ask clarifying questions. You're not going to probe deeply. You're not going to go digging for information. You're going to ask clarifying questions that allow them to kind of explain the chronology. I think what you'll find as you move through this exercise is that they'll begin to offer you a lot more information than you suspect. In fact, I think you'll be surprised by the amount of information as they lay out the chronology of these events. Now again, why I like this approach is that, again, it begins with their concrete experience. They're telling their story. They're identifying the events. Okay. The second thing that happens is they rate those events as they determine whether they're positive or negative, and they give them a rating. They're reflecting on those events. They're beginning to interpret those events. And these two steps together, this first step, is what lays the foundation for considering alternative interpretations, alternative ways of seeing God's work in their lives. Well, again, this is just a brief overview of the experiential learning cycle, an understanding of discipleship that involves discipling people to Jesus and discipling people in Jesus, with discipleship meaning taking people from where they are to where they need to be, and then how that informs the storyline discipleship process that you'll be engaging others with throughout this term. Thank you very much. Hope you have a great day. Look forward to your feedback. Blessings to you.